Hello, wonderful person. This is Philip, and today I'm going to show you how I write cursive. This is not the style I was taught. It's probably not the style you were taught, but I think it's original and I really enjoy this, learning how to write this way. So let's get to it. I'll go through all the letters of the alphabet, capitals and small letters, starting with the capital A. Here we go. I prefer to use this style for my capital A. Of course, you could also do this, which is sort of a big version of the small a. Some people do a capital A in that style. I prefer to do the style on the left. The small a, on the other hand, is fairly simple and straightforward. Just looks like this. Now, the small a is an example of a letter that is small, and that is genuinely small, but doesn't have any ascending or descending parts. We'll get to that in a little bit. Capital B, the standard capital B goes sort of like this. A little bit of railroading here. Let's fill it in. Sometimes I go a little bit overboard with my decorations of the capital B and do something like this, which also looks cute sometimes. It just depends on what the surroundings look like, what the setting is, what I'm writing. Anyway, so you can be a little bit creative, especially with your capitals. The small b, I just do like this, which is fairly standard. The letter C has never been my friend. I'm not sure how to make it really beautiful, but sometimes I do something like this. This may remind you of a certain brand name, which shall remain unmentioned here. Anyway, so there's no reason you can't make decorations like that, make a big tail for your C. A standard capital C would be more like this, or maybe even this. The small c is like this. It's the same height as a small a. So a small a right next to it should look like this. Next, one of my favorite letters, maybe the favorite letter of the alphabet for me, the capital D, which I make like this. As you can see, I'm a little bit heavy on this part. Sometimes I even do something like this, even bigger here. You don't have to do this, but I think it looks neat, so I prefer to write my capital D like this. The small d is like the small a, except it has an ascender here. That means you go up above the height of the small a. So if you were to write something like da da da, well, I just wrote da 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 without the final a here. This is how it would go. This part of both letters is identical and the D just goes up a little bit. They're all supposed to sit right on the baseline. As you can see, I'm not perfect in that respect, but you're not supposed to be perfect either. I don't like using ruled paper just because I want to be more free, more creative. Yeah, of course, it ends up not looking quite as straight, but that's sort of the point. You want to have a little bit of an individual flair in your handwriting. That's why you're using handwriting and not texting on your phone or typing on a computer. Anyway, there is a variant of the small d, the so-called Greek D, that goes like this. Some people do it like this even. This is supposed to be the sign of a creative mind, and apparently you can actually make your own mind more creative by using this letter D instead of the standard D. I personally use it only at the end of a word, so something like and. I will often write like this, but in the middle of the word I almost always use this style of D. Let's get to E, another one of the letters that I don't enjoy all that much in its capital form. You can do it like this, you can be a little bit more ornate. The small e is the same height as a small a, Just looks like this. Try to have this part where you go down, the downstroke, as straight as possible. Try not to make a weird loop like this. It'll just end up looking confusing, I think. So try to be like this with your small e. Other than that, there isn't much to it. Let's get to another one of my favorite letters, capital F. When I was little, learning how to write, we were taught to do F like this, I think, and I already liked it, this portion here. It was my favorite letter back then. Now I do it to an even more extreme extent sometimes. You'll find capital Fs like this in my handwriting. A more standard way, especially in America, of doing it would be this, which I think looks fine too. It actually looks pretty good. This particular one might not have been my best one, but this style, I think there's nothing wrong with this style. It's simple, it's fast, it's still beautiful. So you can do that. Or you can vary it a little bit. All kinds of possibilities with your capital letters. Now the small f is interesting in that it is one of the longest letters. So if you remember, the small a was kind of small like this, like the small c, and this part of the small d. The small f, some people write sort of like this, where they have a big loop or whatever you call it down here and only a small thing up here. I find this a little bit confusing, and I prefer to do this style of F, either like this or like this, where you have an ascender and a descender, where the small f is basically the tallest letter you'll ever write because it goes below the baseline. Baseline is supposed to be here. And above the letter, a small letter a or small x. It's called the x height here, I think. Anyway, whether you do this thing or just go straight up, I think it doesn't matter much. It's really your personal preference. One thing that I do sometimes is I make it weird like this. I don't actually like this. I try to get rid of this. I try to make it either like this or like this. One thing you should be aware of, because I've seen this a lot, is if you write your small f like this is actually not an F at all. It's an S, as in Samuel or Sierra. So the Declaration of Independence, for example, contains this phrase. Let me write it here. It looks somewhat like this. Obviously, it's more beautiful because people back then had to write by hand, so they got a lot more practice than we get. But this actually reads, and such is now the necessity. This is the so-called long S. So don't get any ideas here. This is the word such written in that style. So that's why you shouldn't use this as your small f. One thing I do, however, is a double F. I will sometimes use this style for the first of the two because it ends up looking like this. So this is the word effect. And you can see that I sort of drew the second F back into the first one. This way, I don't think it's too confusing. Everyone will be able to see that this is supposed to be a double F and not an S followed by an F. But yeah, that's the only exception. Other than that, I use either this style or this style. Okay, that's enough of the letter F. Let's get to G. G is kind of interesting because I personally don't like the standard style. I will make my capital G at the very least look like this. And notice it's supposed to go below the baseline. Now, I might be going a little bit overboard here, so if you just do this, it might actually be healthier than doing a big loop down here. One interesting thing is George Washington, who obviously had this as the first letter of his first name, in his signature tended to write it somewhat like this, with another little loop within the loop. I find that very cute and I do it sometimes. The small g looks exactly like a small a, except in the end you go down below the baseline and make a loop down here. So if I write the word gag, you see it's 3 times the same form, except down here the G has the loop under the baseline. So you go below the baseline for that loop. I say this because I see a lot of small G's that look kind of like this, especially in printed handwriting. They basically don't have anything below the baseline. I don't have to tell you that this kind of looks like an A and it's not necessarily the best style. So yeah, this is how you make the small G. Let's go to H. My capital H is usually something like this. You can make a simpler version of the same thing. I believe this is how we were taught. The 2 lines here should really not touch and should remain parallel. So let me try to make this simple style a little bit better. They're still not quite parallel here, but you get the idea. You can also be more elaborate with this, as always. This is up to you, and capitals don't happen all that much, so celebrate them. Okay, the small h is just like a small n, except it has an ascending loop here. So if you write ha, you can see that this portion down here that sort of looks like a small n is the height of the small a, but then you have the loop that goes above that height. But other than that, there's nothing special to my h. Okay, let's get to the next letter. I. Capital I. Well, we were taught a very simple style of capital I. I believe we were supposed to do it just like this. Nowadays, I tend to do something like this. Yeah, you can, again, with a capital, get a little bit creative. The small I is just very simple like this. And of course, it has a dot. Don't forget to dot your I's. The capital J, a standard way of doing a capital J is sort of like this, but there's nothing wrong with doing something like this instead. I believe John Hancock, the actual John Hancock with his signature, who obviously had this as the first letter of his first name, used a style similar to this, not so much like this. So I prefer something like this, although capital J doesn't happen all that much. And the small j is like the small I, except just like the small g, it has a loop below the baseline. Just as a reminder, the baseline in all these is sort of here. Okay, so here's the letter J. Next, K, one of my favorite letters. Okay, I put this G here for some reason, so let's make a K here. Now the G has the baseline right here, so it goes below the baseline. The capital K will not go below the baseline, but I really like to celebrate my capital Ks. I make them like this. Don't ask me why I do it like this. It's probably because K is such a rare letter, especially as a capital, that I take my time with it. You can make this style much simpler. This is also a perfectly acceptable capital K. The small k should look like a small k, not like a capital K. So that means, again, you have all of this going on at the height of a small a, and then just this loop extending above. I mention this because there is something that people who know a little bit about how to draw psychological conclusions from a person's handwriting will tend to see a small k that's written sort of like this, kind of like a capital K, as a big alarm sign that this person has a severe problem with authority. So just be aware of that. Small k, just like this. Okay, next, L. My L's are sort of like my C's. I actually do the same thing sometimes with my L's. So you can make a big tail like this. Why not? It's cute, it's fun, but you can also make a very simple capital L. This is also perfectly acceptable as a capital L. The small l goes just like the small e, except taller. So it doesn't stay at the height of a small a, but it goes up. But again, the downstroke should be mostly straight. This is your small l. So if I write a word like electric, here you can see the difference between the small e and the small l. They're sort of the same thing, except the l is much longer. Okay, so we have that. Let me try to get this tiny little hair that got onto my pen out of it. I'm doing this off camera so that you're not disturbed in your learning of these beautiful letter forms. We are at the letter M. My capital M goes like this. There's nothing wrong with making a capital M sort of like a small m, only bigger. I think it goes like this. You can make a big tail for this also if you like. I've seen that and have no problem with it, but I personally write my capital M's like this. The small m, on the other hand, fairly standard. I like to be narrow with my small m, sort of like this. It's just my style, but I really have no preference in other people's handwriting, whether it's narrow or broad like this. The N, we have a similar story as with the M. For the capital, I like to use a shape somewhat like this, but there's no problem if you make a capital N sort of like a small, big version of the small n. The small n in any case is like this. Now, there isn't much to say about the small n and the small m. One thing I will say is that you can be aware of the fact that you can either start round for both of these, sort of like this, or start pointy. I don't really have a preference between the two. It's just, I think for me it mainly depends on what kind of letter I have in front of this, whether I end up doing this or more of this. This happens with a lot of letters. The small y is another typical example of where I can either go like this or like this. But anyway, we're getting to the small y a little bit later. So small n, just like this. O is a very boring letter. I usually write it like this for the capital and like this for the small one. If you make a loop in the O in here, it's not a big deal. I just think it looks a little bit better if the loop is very small to non-existent. But the letter O is the same height as the small a. The small o, obviously. Okay, P. P is similar to B, so you can again just do a rather simple style of P like this, or you can do all kinds of weird things like this. My personal preference is probably this style for P, for the capital P. The small p is an interesting letter because lots of people, including myself, are taught to do it somewhat like this. So I wrote paper here. In any case, the p should go below the baseline with this part, but I have recently started modifying my p's a little bit and writing them instead like this. I also did a different R here, we're getting to the R. So I go a little bit above the height of the small a, sometimes a lot. I mean, sometimes you'll see me using this style. It really depends on what my mood is at the moment. So yeah, it basically looks like a small n, except you go up and down and then do the rest of the letter. I don't know if you can live with something like this or if you want to stick with something which is, from a modern perspective, probably more legible, like this. It's up to you. Next, the letter Q. It doesn't happen much, and it sort of looks like a numeral 2, the way most people write it, especially if you start here instead of down here. I sometimes do this. Surprise, surprise, I do a big tail for the letter Q. So my words, this is quid, as in quid pro quo, end up looking kind of like this. The small q I do in a very simple way. I start exactly the same way as a small a, then I go down like this. So the difference between the small q and the small g in my handwriting is simply that the small g has this loop, whereas the small q just goes straight down and then straight up, so to speak. Now, capital R. The capital R is similar to capital B and capital P, so again you have all kinds of variants that you can do here. And you just finish it like this. Or, of course, a more simple style, excuse me, like this. For the small r, you've already seen two different variants. In the middle of the word, I tend to use this version of the small r because I find it easier to connect to the letter after it. But at the end of the word, I sometimes do this because I find this little dot thingy that I do kind of cute. So, yeah, at the beginning or in the middle of the word, I'll usually use this style, although the other style is perfectly possible also. It's just harder for me, that's why I tend to avoid it. At the end of the word, I sometimes do something like here for my small r. Now, capital S. My capital S usually looks very much like a small s, except bigger. Let's put the small s next to it. You can see it's almost the same thing. But sometimes I make a capital S like this to mix it up a little bit. So yeah, feel free to vary your style a little bit. It makes it more interesting, as long as you make sure that people can still read the words that you write. This is perfectly fine. Now, we've already discussed the long S, which I personally don't really use, so I always stick to this. Normally I would write a word like necessity, like so. So each time I do this S, and at the end of the word is, for example, I also make it finish here. I've seen a lot of this style where people will put sort of a tail at the end of their S. I personally find it a little bit confusing, but I can't deny that it looks cute, so if you want to go for this, by all means, be my guest. You won't see me doing it though, especially not at the end of the word. Now, the capital T looks very much like the capital F, and all these variations are possible, except you don't do this last little thing in the middle. So the T, if you do a simple one, is this, which is kind of easy to confuse with a J or even an I. So I tend to do something more like this. But again, you can be really big on this. Do something like that. It's a capital. Capitals don't happen all that much, so enjoy them while they're there. For the small t, we were actually taught, interestingly enough, to make our small t's like this, which is confusing to lots of people because it sort of looks like a capital A, except a little bit thin and weird. But I still use a variation of this style sometimes, but mainly I just use this as my small t. Now, there's a lot that can be said about how exactly you form your letters, and I have left most of this out of this particular video because it's already long enough as it is, and I just want to show you how to write cursive. But one thing about the T, which a lot of people are also aware of, subconsciously or consciously, is if you cross your T's very low, it indicates low self-esteem. If you cross them very high, well, this is not very high yet, but I've seen higher than this, it might indicate that you're full of yourself in a way. So just try to be sort of in the middle. Now, the different styles of T. Let me write a word like that, for example. Here you can already see that I left a little bit more space between the T and the H than would probably be optimal. And then I'll finish it off by crossing everything, crossing these two T's with just one stroke. So I find this acceptable. I actually find it kind of nice. However, when there isn't another T in the same word, and I have a TH formation, I often do this style of T. And I leave it like this. I don't cross it. This down here is so that counts sort of as crossing the T. This is my word the with a small t. Simply because it allows me to put the T and the H closer together, which I think looks prettier, and you don't have to worry about when you cross it getting into the H, which kind of sometimes looks weird. Another thing about crossing the small t is certain words, such as the word time, I celebrate by crossing my T like so. So this is how I write time most of the time. This is small t. Capital T would obviously at this point start looking kind of similar to this, but still kind of different. Anyway, so you can play around with these as I've demonstrated. That's fine. Or you can do the T the same way each time. There's nothing wrong with writing the word that like this. Depends on how rebellious or tame you're feeling at the time, I guess. Okay, let's get to the next letter of the alphabet. U. My capital U is like this. Nothing fancy, but I'm happy with it. The small u is very similar. So it looks like the small a, except obviously here you stay straight, you don't go over like this. One little remark here, if you write the small n fast, it'll end up looking like a U, so just be careful to make it so that people, and yourself included, can still distinguish between your small u's and your small n's. V. My capital V is like this. Can make a simple style like this if you prefer. My small v tends to be a little bit round, but I've seen this also. As long as people can still distinguish it from your small r, especially if you use this style for the r, you're going to be okay with any type of v like this. Next, W. My capital W is very similar to my capital V, except more curvy. And my small w is kind of interesting because we were taught in school, literally, to do it like this, which I think looks kind of ridiculous. But when you write this a little bit faster, it tends to transform into something like this, which is my usual small w. Now the letter X. I hardly ever write a capital X, but if I have to write one, I'll probably try to do it like this. Maybe put the two bars a little bit closer together, but like I said, it doesn't happen much in my writing. You could even imagine a double bar here. This is a fairly standard capital X, I think. My small x, on the other hand, is not very standard, but I think what I've started to do is much prettier. I'll write a whole word. I'll write the word example. So you can see here that I actually lift the pen off the paper and then start over here again for my small x. I just think this looks much prettier than the standard. I think the standard way of writing it would be, I'm not even sure, I think like this. Let's just write exam, and then you cross this x. This looks fine also, but I just think this looks prettier. So again, actually lift the pen up, which I rarely do. If you've noticed in my cursive, I hardly ever lift the pen off the paper, but this is one of the occasions where I do, to form my small x. Okay, that's enough of the letter X, because it doesn't happen all that much either. Y. My capital Y, sort of like my capital U, except it goes below the baseline with this loop. And my small y is similar, again, below the baseline. So a word like U would look like this. And we're at the last letter of the alphabet, which is also a little bit challenging for me, because I prefer, for the capital Z in any case, this style. Or sometimes I make this tail bigger. Let me start a new line here so I can get a bigger word in. See, again, this tail that I often like to celebrate in my capitals. See, it kind of looks neat. But again, use your own discretion. This looks perfectly fine also. Now, I have to admit, I don't even know the standard way of writing a capital Z. I think it looks sort of like this, but I never got used to this style, so I always use this style for my capital Z. And it's similar with the small z, except we were taught to write the small z just like this, even in cursive. So a word like lazy, would look like this in my handwriting. Then, of course, there is the more common way of writing a small z in cursive, which I believe is very similar to the small y, sort of like this. Don't quote me on this because I never actually do this. But I've adopted a hybrid between the two, which I think is a very good compromise. So the way I actually write a word like lazy is the z like this. I just think this is the best of both worlds, so to speak. So this is how I make my small z. Okay, this video is about a half an hour long at this point, so I'm going to call it a day for now. I've gone through all the letters of the alphabet. If you have any comments, any questions, would like to see anything in particular, I'll make another video. Just request it in the comments down below. Other than that, I hope you have a beautiful day.